Thank you, sir. Thanks. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to lovely San Diego. I felt very much at home yesterday when I arrived and it was raining because it was just like Portland. So the sunshine's kind of throwing me off my game, but really happy to be here this morning. We've got about 25 minutes or 30 minutes of some prepared remarks. And I want to offer my thoughts to you on 20 by 20. But before starting, I want to share a video with you. You know, it's kind of interesting when I saw that video because I thought it was appropriate because what I'm about to talk about is really about perspective. And it's about taking a lot of seemingly disparate pieces of information and trying to stitch them together, much like that sculptor stitched together a lot of odd pieces to form the vision that you saw when you looked at it from a certain direction. So I want to start out by saying this is about one man's perspective. And I say that very humbly. Some people, the gentleman who just introduced me, have referred to me as being pretty outspoken, and I am. And I want to let everybody know that I do that from a place of humility because I really can only offer my point of view and my perspective. And lastly, I'm asking you to be open-minded. I'm not asking you to necessarily agree with me, but for the next 25 minutes, let's just suspend judgment. Let's take an opportunity to share some perspective, and let's take a look at what the future might look like in 2020. So what are we going to do over the next 30 minutes? I want to start off by kind of level setting. What is 20 for 20 really all about? What does it mean? It sounds great, 2020, there's a nice ring to it, right? It's perfect vision, it's clarity, but what's behind it? What does it mean? Then I want to ask, will today's drivers get us to tomorrow? Will the things that are making craft grow today get us to 20 by 20? What are the implications of that? What are some concerns once we get there? If we fast forward to 2020, what might we find if we've reached that magical 20 share? I'll offer some closing thoughts, and then I'll have some time to take some questions. So let's level set. What is craft? I have said very often, craft is in the eye of the beholder. But I don't want you to take my word for it. There was a study done by the Demeter Group where they asked consumers if they thought the following beers were craft. And what was shocking about it to many people was that more people thought Blue Moon was craft than Sierra Nevada, than Lagunitas, than Pyramid, than Samuel Adams. And you know, it's interesting because regardless of what the BA says, and regardless of whether I agree or they agree or the BI agrees or anybody, ultimately it depends on the consumer what is craft. So the first piece of open-mindedness I'd like for you to have is I'm going to take a consumer point of view when I discuss craft for the rest of the session. And by the consumer definition, again from the same Demeter study, not my words, their words, I ask the question, is 20 by 20 simply trend? If you look at their analysis, and if you look at what they call consumer-defined craft, and you just trend it out based on this study, the craft beer market will get to somewhere between 20 and 24 share by the year 2020, just extrapolating out existing growth rates and assuming a flat beer market. So if you think about that, take a consumer point of view, let's ground ourselves. Is it really 20 by 20? Or should we be talking about 50 million barrels? Is that the real target? 50 million barrels. So let's play with that. For the rest of this session, keep 50 million in your mind. And ask yourselves, what is it going to take for the craft industry to get to that 50 million barrels? Not a nebulous 20 share, not a 24 share, but 50 million barrels of craft. And hey, what could possibly go wrong? I mean, everything is going our way. We have tailwinds, not the headwinds that Chris talked about on his flight over here, but we've got everything going for us. The consumer trends are with us, be that local, be that more artisanal, be it variety, be it willingness to pay more for a better beverage. We've got momentum. We're in a flat beer market, and for the 5th consecutive year, craft off of an increasing base will grow at double digits. That's the stuff case studies are made of. So the momentum's with us. We have a generation of transformed palates. Talk to a 22-year-old or a 28-year-old and just envision what their future is going to be like because they grew up in this beer renaissance that we're currently experiencing. Chances are they will have a light lager at some point, but it will be part of their repertoire, not their repertoire. We also have a generation of home brewers. This statistic is staggering. There's 1.2 million home brewers out there now who reportedly brew over 2 million barrels of beer. This is a sea change. And lastly, we have a margin-rich value chain. Most of the people in this room are making a lot of money doing something they love to do. So what could possibly go wrong? So let's ask the question, will today's drivers, the things that are causing all of that great success, get us to tomorrow? And I would submit to you there's 3 main drivers of the craft beer movement today. One is small and local, the second is draft, and the third is on-premise. So let's take a look at all those. Small and local. This chart is pretty interesting. And what it does is, on the horizontal axis, it's the number of breweries in a given state. And on the vertical axis on the left is the legal drinking age population of that state. And the size of the bubble is the size of the beer market. Funny thing jumps out to you on this chart. California stands alone. Largest number of legal drinking age consumers, largest number of breweries, largest beer market in the US. So I'd submit to you, if I look at this, the analyst in me says there's a lot of run room geographically. Because while California might be unique, it's probably not all that special when it comes right down to the consumer. So how many are we talking? You've seen these charts before. From the BI, number of breweries exponentially growing. Everybody's, how many can it take? If you look on the right, and I know it's tough to read, there's over 500 breweries in the state of California. That's why that bubble was where it was on that prior chart. What's interesting is there are still more breweries in California than the next 4 largest states combined. Think about that. More breweries in California than Texas, Florida, New York, and Pennsylvania combined. So, there will be continued explosion of breweries, in my humble opinion, my perspective. But the question is, will that be enough? What's interesting here is you take a look at the number of breweries in the output. On the left, what you see is that 70% of the breweries, that big red swath, only produce 0.3% of the beer in the United States. In fact, over 90% of all of those breweries that are exploding are under 7,500 barrels. And they brew an average of 864. Fact. So let's play a little game. What would happen if the number of breweries under 7,500 barrels doubled? And if the output of the existing breweries doubled? That's still only going to be 4 million barrels of beer. So if our target's 50, and doubling the number of breweries is only going to get us 4, small and local ain't going to cut it. What about draft? Draft has been growing over the last 6 years. but it's still only 10% of the beer market. What does that mean? Not by draft alone. It's not going to get it. Even if craft reached 100 share of draft, that's still only 20 million barrels. We're less than half the way there. So if it's not going to just be small and local, and it's not going to just be draft, clearly it's the on-premise, right? That's where we're eating the big guy's lunch. What's interesting is the on-premise segment continues to decline. There are economic factors behind it. There are societal factors behind it. And we know that that's effectively a zero-sum game. We're growing share there, but it's a declining segment. And even if we got to 100 share of on-premise, that's only 36 million barrels. So, what channels are going to need to play a role in the future? If you take a look, we're not going to get to 50 million barrels unless the industry starts to become more off-premise, unless there's more grocery volume, unless there's more liquor store volume, unless there's more C-store volume. And oh no, it's not just about the beer bars. It's about Costco, and it's about Walmart, and it's about Safeway, and it's about Rite Aid, and it's about Kroger, and the list goes on. Because small and local is only going to get us 4 million more barrels. 100 share of draft would only get us 20 million barrels, and 100 share of the on-premise would only get us 36. So I would submit to you, again, humbly, the future for craft is not just draft, local, on-premise. It's going to have to start to be there. So what are some of those enablers? Well, if we're going to have to go off-premise, we're going to have to be more packaged. Well, that means that we need to have packaging capability, and we need to have packaging quality, and I'll talk about that in a couple of slides. We also need to have a supply chain that can get that packaged beer where it needs to go in a quality, consistent way. If we're going to be more off-premise, we need off-premise selling skills. Because as many of you know, calling on the local bar is very different than calling on Walmart or Safeway. We also need to have stable beer. There's that quality word again. Because it's not just about somebody coming in and getting a growler, taking it home and drinking it in 2 days. It's about a bottle being able to withstand the supply chain and the time for it to sit on the shelf. Bad word for craft, chain. Bad word in Portland, Oregon, chain. But if we want to get to 50 million barrels, we're going to have to be more chain-oriented. So what does that mean? Call point coverage. Ask yourselves how many small craft brewers actually know where the headquarter call is and whether or not it's centralized or decentralized and how to make that call. Do you have distribution? Can you cover the retailer's footprint? I will guarantee you that an account will not give you a national mandate or a regional mandate if you can't cover every one of their stores. And lastly, it takes retailer management. How do you make sure that once you've got that mandate and once you've got everything, that it's going the way you want? And we've got to get beyond local. So what does beyond local look like? Again, distribution footprint. It's not just selling out the front door anymore. It's not just draft out the front door. It's not the 20 accounts around the corner, but it's actually starting to grow the distribution footprint. And again, that supply chain word comes up. And wholesaler management. And all the rhetoric around franchise laws and carve-out start to become real because it's not rhetoric anymore. It's day-to-day, it's business. But what about quality and consistency in this world of tomorrow? Well, you know what's interesting is it's not just about the ingredients anymore. For those 2,500 breweries that are only brewing 864 barrels a year, it's really easier to focus on just brewing great beer. It's the latest hop, and we'll talk about hops. It's the latest grain. But here, it's not just about brewing great beer. The key is ensuring quality all the way from grain to glass, regardless of whether that was poured out of a draft handle or poured out of a bottle or poured out of a can. and it's about ensuring it consistently. Think about the world we're getting into where consumer expectations on a national basis, they don't think of beer and wine in the same way. You get a vintage of wine, and it tastes different than the vintage you had before, and that's cachet. You get a bottle of beer that tastes different than the bottle that you had before, and that's inconsistent quality. Those are the standards we've got, though. And think of regulatory standards, and think of the new FDA ruling, where if we start to stitch these pieces together, again, perspective, if you want to play in national chains, and you got that mandate, and you have the distribution coverage, all of a sudden, we now need to tell them how many calories are in the beer. And we need to be able to warrant that there'll be the same number of calories and the same technical specs, bottle after bottle after bottle. That's a different ballgame. And what about regulatory? This is a snapshot. I don't expect you to read it, but this is just out of the Brewer's Almanac. And this shows you just how different every state is. So the US is a country, but there's 50 plus sets of regulations that we need to learn and multiple government agencies to navigate. And what about cost? Because the margin's good now, guys. It's really good. But I want to play a little game here. I'm going to take you through a hypothetical comparison between a small local draft brewer and a bigger regional packaged brewer. These numbers are not real. I'll reiterate that. They are rooted in fact. They are not just our numbers. They are numbers from a range of sources, and they're indicative. So, what does the value chain look like? Well, raw materials are somewhere in the 8% range. You've got packaging on top of that, but this is just cooperage, right? Because we're just doing draft here. Then you've got some controllable costs, variable labor and non-labor in your breweries. On top of that, you've got a little swath for tax. Keep in mind, you're a small brewer, so you're only paying $7 a barrel. And then guess what? The rest is margin. Nice, big red swath. Let's go to the right. Same raw material costs. Maybe there's some synergies there. Maybe buying power gets there. Oh, I'm packaged now. Component costs for packaged beer generally double what Cooper's costs are. Our friends at OI can talk about that way more intelligently than I can. Your controllable costs, though, might go down, because when you get bigger, you scale, and I'll talk about that in a couple of slides. Fascinating when you look at the relationship between cost of brewing, variable labor and non-labor, and the size of your brewery. Your tax goes up, though. You're paying $18 now. Oh, I'm an off-premise. I'm packaged. Probably going to need to do some QDs or some promotional discounts, so I've got discounting now. Oh, I have to ship it. I've got freight charges now. I've got to warehouse it. I've got to put it somewhere. Oh, I need a wholesaler, because I can't distribute it myself all over the country to cover that national chain mandate. That's what's left for me. Not real numbers, but indicative, rooted in fact. Wow. A lot of money not there anymore. And you know what? That's a dilemma. Because tomorrow's reality for us, as we go to 50 million barrels, is more expensive. We're going to be paying higher FETs. We're going to have higher distribution costs. You're going to have higher packaging costs. You're going to have wholesaler margins and all the costs that go along with it. And it's going to require more investment. Wow. I've got less money in my pocket and I need to spend more because I need a sales organization now. I can't just do it myself. I have to actually pay for data, and I need to develop some selling skills. There's advertising and marketing costs, and I'll talk about that in a couple of slides. I've got to worry about administrative and regulatory. I've got to spend on QA. I've got to have some lab equipment so I can meet those technical standards that the FDA is requiring for those national chain mandates, and I actually have to get involved in the industry. So if we can navigate all that, I'd argue we can reap the benefit of the tailwinds that we've got. I believe craft can get to 50 million barrels, but I believe it's going to take us addressing some of those barriers along the way. And I believe once we get there, there are some things we need to think about. So what are some concerns? There is a great philosopher that I love to quote named Voltaire. That's him. That's not a Portland hipster. And he was quoted to say, with great power comes great responsibility. So again, very humbly, I would submit to everybody in this room that when craft gets to 50 million barrels, we all need to start thinking about something else. We can't just worry about craft anymore. We've got to start worrying about beer. Because we're not just a small guy riding on the big guy's coattails anymore. We're the man. We're the big guy. And the question I would ask everybody is, if we're shaping the future of the beer industry, don't we need to ensure that the future won't be a more vibrant segment in a diminished industry? Let's think about that for a second. It's really tough when your last name is Beer if the only thing cool about you is your first name. Because it means your family's not cool. Craft can't continue to be cool if beer isn't cool, if beer isn't relevant. Because we can talk about it and we can fight amongst ourselves as much as we want. But the bottom line is 50 million barrels means that we are they, and we have to start worrying about beer. So what are some concerns? Let's talk about capacity. So the chart on the right, again, real data, is illustrative of what happens to your controllable brewery costs as you get bigger. Very simply, small breweries on the left, very high cost per barrel. Big breweries on the right, tons of scale. It's why, as a publicly traded company, our gross margins are about 1,000 basis points, 10 points lower than Boston beers, and why Boston beers are somewhere between 10 and 12 points lower than somebody like Anheuser-Busch. Fact. A lot of it's rooted in that scale. So, if we think of the future, think of 2020, not all capacity is created equal, is it? Different breweries were designed for different purposes. So if you think about this, and you think about that chart on the right, will a lot of small breweries make sense for anyone? High-cost breweries, remember that margin dilemma I talked about? So if the future is this arms race of capacity with people opening breweries everywhere, not to play the small local game, but to play the national game, is that good? I don't have an answer, just asking the question. Conversely, what's going to happen to all that overcapacity in the large breweries? If we're going to go from 20 million barrels to 50 million barrels, that's 30 million barrels of capacity, overcapacity in these large breweries. Stop and think about that. What's the impact on pricing? Oh my God, we're already economically pressed because I'm paying more in FET, I've got wholesaler costs now to deal with, I've got freight costs to deal with, my brewery is small, and now the big guys are playing the price card because they've got breweries that they need to keep efficiently. What's the impact on beer styles? We announced a brewery partnership recently with Blue City Brewing in Memphis, Tennessee. That brewery was built by Stroh's back in the 70s. It's a lager brewery. Horizontal fermenters, big batches. If there's a lot of that capacity out there, what's that going to mean for tomorrow? Because it's really tough to brew a very highly hopped IPA in a brewery with horizontal fermenters that was built for big batches of lager. Hops. We all love hops. Let's look at 5 components of vital ingredients to what we do in 2020. Over the last decade, US beer production has been relatively flat. The amount of grain used, relatively flat as well. Some mix in there, some efficiency, specialty malts, what's going on. Globally, the number of hectares under cultivation for hops has actually declined. And hop production globally has kind of been all over the place. But look at that. The amount of hops per barrel, dry hops per barrel in the US, data right from the Brewer's Almanac, has tripled over the last decade. Tripled. What are we doing about this? This is collectively our problem. We all think if you build it, they will come. But I got to tell you, a lot of you know this already. Talk to people who talk to the hop farmers. They're in an industry that's competitive as well. And if there's a good crop somewhere else, hops are a very labor-intensive business, and you can't necessarily find the people to pick them all at the right time, and there might be a better source for that land than hops. So, concerning. Public policy. This is a great one. Something we don't talk about a lot, because we're just worried about the beer, right? We just want to make great beer. We want to use Centennial hops. We want to use Citra. We want to use some great Nelsons, and life will be good. Public policy. If you take a look at this, this breaks out the tax revenue paid by the beer industry to the US government. In the year 2012, the beer industry paid $3.6 billion in taxes. The interesting thing is that 90% of those taxes, $2.8 billion, came from only 7/10 of the breweries in the US. And everybody largely in this room is well under that. So the question I want to ask is, in the year 2020, when 50 million barrels are coming from brewers who are not all in that tax bracket, what happens to the importance of the beer lobby in Washington? What happens when Ways and Means is starting to look at ways to raise revenue to close the deficit? We've been very effective as an industry at keeping this the way it is and keeping the incentives there for small brewers. But what happens when the tax base starts going down and there's more risk for us in terms of being a united lobby in Washington? And then lastly, if we're 50 million barrels, who's going to keep up the image of the industry? And this is debatable. I'm asking you to be open-minded. Is the future advertising as we know it today? Is it digital? Is it all social media? I don't know. But on a fair share basis, this means craft would be spending $300 million on advertising by the year 2020. We're not even close right now. And if we're 50 million barrels, you got to believe that the big guys aren't going to be spending what they're spending anymore. And just asking, who's going to produce the Super Bowl ads that keep beer prominent in 2020? Because if we're the big guy, it's probably got to be somebody in this room or somebody you know. So in closing, I think 2020 is realistic. I really do. I am bullish as hell about where the consumer will take craft beer. But it's going to take a dual approach. We need more of the same. I think all these breweries propping up all over the US, I think the local game, I think that is good. I hope we see the number of breweries in Texas and Florida and New York and Pennsylvania and North Carolina. I hope we see them continue to grow because it creates vibrancy and it helps change the consumer perception of beer. That's all good. But we also need some more big beer behavior in more places. And we need to be able to work together on that big beer behavior. And then lastly, I think the leaders of craft today also need to think more like the stewards of the beer industry of tomorrow. And with that, I will say thank you very much and take some questions.